36 days before Marilyn Monroe would sing Happy Birthday to President Kennedy, she faced a different kind of performance. Harper's Bazaar had booked her for what should have been routine work. A few hours of posing, some wardrobe changes, professional smiles for America's most prestigious fashion magazine. Instead, the session became something witnesses would discuss in hushed tones for years afterward. The photographer expected cooperation. What he encountered was resistance, frustration, and behavior that seemed to signal something breaking inside Hollywood's most valuable commodity. By the time Marilyn left that studio, relationships had fractured, creative visions had collided, and in the days that followed, as crew members compared notes about what they'd witnessed, a troubling pattern emerged. This wasn't temperament, this wasn't artistic disagreement, this was a woman sending distress signals that almost nobody recognized until it was too late. The images Harper's Bazaar published looked luminous. The reality behind them was disintegrating. Before we continue with what really happened in that Manhattan studio, if you find these untold stories from Hollywood's golden age fascinating, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the hidden truths behind the icons you thought you knew. February 1962 marked a peculiar moment in fashion history. Harper's Bazaar had built its reputation on transforming women into fantasies. Their photographers didn't just capture images, they manufactured dreams. The process required precision. Models arrived hours early for hair and makeup. Lighting technicians spent days preparing sets. Creative directors orchestrated every detail, from fabric draping to finger placement, ensuring each frame conveyed the magazine's sophisticated vision. For most subjects, this represented the pinnacle of professional achievement. Marilyn Monroe had experienced this machinery countless times. She'd posed for Life, Look, Vogue, countless magazine covers that turned her face into currency. By early 1962, she understood the game better than almost anyone working in fashion photography. Arrive on time, follow direction, give them the angles they wanted. The relationship between photographer and subject operated on unspoken rules. The lens demanded, the model complied. Efficiency mattered because studio time cost money, and magazines operated on strict production schedules that left little room for artistic disagreement or personal crisis. But something had shifted in Marilyn Monroe during the winter of 1962. The woman who arrived at Harper's Bazaar's Manhattan studio that February carried burdens the creative team couldn't fully comprehend. Her recent psychiatric hospitalization at Payne Whitney had left scars deeper than anyone outside her intimate circle understood. The pills prescribed to help her sleep now controlled her waking hours. Her marriage to Arthur Miller had dissolved, leaving her without the intellectual anchor she desperately sought. Fox Studios had fired her from Something's Got to Give after months of production chaos. And beneath all of this, the Kennedy brothers represented a complication she couldn't discuss with therapists, couldn't explain to friends, couldn't escape no matter how many sleeping pills she consumed in those dark hotel rooms. The Harper's Bazaar shoot represented more than professional obligation. It symbolized everything Marilyn had come to despise about her existence. The reduction of human complexity into marketable images, the endless performance of desirability for men who would consume her picture without caring about the woman creating it. The fashion industry's demand that she embody youth and sexuality at 35, an age when Hollywood had already begun writing her obituary. She needed the money. Her tax problems had become severe. But she also needed something the magazine couldn't provide, recognition as a thinking, feeling person rather than a decorative object to be arranged and photographed. The photographer assigned to shoot Marilyn that day operated according to standard industry practice. He'd prepared his vision, studied previous Monroe images to understand which angles worked best. His reputation depended on delivering images that met Harper's Bazaar's exacting standards while capturing something fresh about a subject the public had seen thousands of times before. He approached the session with professional confidence. This was Marilyn Monroe. She'd been photographed more than any woman alive. She understood how this worked. What he hadn't prepared for was resistance. Marilyn arrived 90 minutes late, a delay that immediately compressed the shooting schedule and created tension among crew members who'd been waiting since early morning. Her makeup appeared incomplete. Dark circles under her eyes suggested inadequate sleep. When she finally entered the studio space, her body language communicated discomfort that contradicted the confident sexuality she'd spent years projecting. The photographer began positioning her according to his predetermined shot list. Marilyn questioned the poses, not with the collaborative spirit that defined successful creative partnerships, but with something sharper. Why this angle? Why this lighting? Why did he want her body twisted in ways that emphasized curves over humanity? The creative director intervened, attempting to smooth the friction developing between photographer and subject. Harper's Bazaar had paid substantial fees for this session. They'd allocated limited studio time. Professional models didn't question artistic direction. They trusted the photographer's vision and delivered what the magazine required. But Marilyn wasn't questioning from ignorance. She'd worked with Richard Avedon, Bert, and other legendary photographers who understood her intelligence. She recognized when a creative team viewed her as a collaborator versus when they saw her as a product to be packaged. This team, despite their professional credentials, seemed interested only in reproducing the Marilyn Monroe they already knew. The blonde bombshell, the sex symbol, the fantasy that had nothing to do with the woman standing in their studio. Between setups, witnesses reported observing Marilyn retreat to her dressing area for increasingly longer intervals. She'd emerge, attempt another series of shots, then request another break. Models didn't dictate session pace, they didn't disappear repeatedly during expensive studio time, they performed. But Marilyn seemed incapable of delivering the performance this particular day, or perhaps she'd simply decided she wouldn't. The distinction mattered. One suggested professional incompetence, the other implied intentional rebellion. Somewhere around the third hour, the tension that had been building throughout the session finally erupted. The exact trigger remains disputed. Some witnesses remembered the photographer demanding a specific pose that Marilyn found demeaning. Others recalled Marilyn objecting to how roughly wardrobe assistants had handled her during a costume change. A few reported hearing raised voices but couldn't distinguish specific words over the studio's ambient noise. What everyone agreed on was the moment when professional courtesy collapsed entirely. Marilyn stopped mid-pose, stepped away from the set, and made clear she was finished cooperating with the photographer's vision. The creative director attempted negotiation. Perhaps they could try different approaches. Maybe Marilyn had ideas about poses she'd find more comfortable. Could they take a longer break, order food, reset the atmosphere and start fresh? But Marilyn's resistance had calcified into something beyond simple artistic disagreement. She felt disrespected, objectified, reduced once again to body parts and blonde hair, despite everything she'd accomplished, every acting class she'd attended, every book she'd consumed, trying to prove she possessed depth beyond her physical appearance. The Harper's Bazaar team saw an uncooperative model sabotaging an expensive shoot. Marilyn saw yet another group of industry professionals treating her exactly like every studio executive, every director, every man who'd promised to see her talent while staring at her breasts. The session didn't end with dramatic confrontation or explosive argument. It ended with exhaustion. Both sides recognized they couldn't produce the images Harper's Bazaar required under these circumstances. The magazine had secured enough usable shots to fulfill their contractual obligations, though fewer than they'd hoped, and none that captured the special magic that made Marilyn Monroe photographs culturally significant. Marilyn gathered her belongings, offered perfunctory goodbyes, and left the studio with an entourage that had learned not to ask questions about her emotional state. The crew began breaking down equipment, already discussing how they'd explain the abbreviated session to editors who'd been expecting breakthrough images. But the real story wasn't what happened in the studio. It was what unfolded afterward, in the days and weeks following that truncated February session. Marilyn returned to her Brentwood home, carrying the weight of another professional disappointment. She'd tried asserting boundaries, she'd attempted to be seen as more than a decorative object, and she'd watched it fail. The industry didn't want her complexity, it wanted her compliance. The immediate consequences manifested in ways only those closest to Marilyn witnessed. Her housekeeper Eunice Murray reported finding her employer increasingly despondent during the weeks following the Harper's Bazaar session. Marilyn would spend hours in bed, curtains drawn against California sunlight, pharmaceutical bottles accumulating on her nightstand. She'd attempt phone calls to friends and former lovers, seeking connection or reassurance or simply voices that might pull her back from the darkness closing in. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, documented increasing concern about his patient's psychological state during this period. The Harper's Bazaar incident represented more than a difficult photo shoot in Greenson's analysis. It symbolized Marilyn's deteriorating ability to maintain the professional facade that had sustained her career. She was becoming unable to perform Marilyn Monroe even when economic survival demanded it. The pills that were supposed to help her function had instead created dependency that complicated every aspect of her life. Sleep came only with chemical assistance. Waking required stimulants to counteract the sedatives. Meanwhile, Harper's Bazaar faced its own complications from the session. The magazine published several images from the February shoot in subsequent issues, accompanied by the kind of glowing copy that characterized fashion journalism. Readers saw glamorous photographs. They remained unaware of the tension that had produced them, but within industry circles, word spread about Marilyn's behavior during the session. Photographers and creative directors traded stories about her lateness, her resistance, her inability to deliver professional performance. The narrative that emerged painted Marilyn as difficult, unreliable, someone whose star had dimmed beyond recovery. Nobody discussed the possibility that her behavior signaled mental health crisis rather than professional decline. The Harper's Bazaar incident wasn't isolated. Similar difficulties had plagued other professional commitments during Marilyn's final months. The Something's Got to Give production had descended into chaos, partly because of her absences and unpredictable behavior. Photo sessions with other magazines and photographers had produced uneven results. The pattern suggested someone struggling with forces beyond her control, but Hollywood's response focused on professional liability rather than human welfare. Studios and magazines began viewing Marilyn Monroe as uninsurable risk rather than troubled person deserving help. What made the Harper's Bazaar session particularly significant was its timing. 36 days later, Marilyn would deliver her infamous Happy Birthday performance for President Kennedy at Madison Square Garden. That appearance, which would become culturally iconic, required every ounce of strength Marilyn could muster. She arrived late to that event, too. She struggled with her costume, a skin-tight dress that required assistance to wear, but when spotlight hit her and she began singing, something clicked. She delivered the performance exactly as required, sexy, playful, slightly scandalous, perfectly pitched to the moment. The disconnect between what she could produce for a president and what she couldn't deliver for a fashion magazine revealed the selective nature of her struggles. She could still perform Marilyn Monroe when the stakes felt high enough, but routine professional work had become nearly impossible. The Harper's Bazaar session represented a warning sign that almost nobody heeded. Marilyn was communicating distress through her behavior, through her resistance, through her inability to comply with industry expectations. But the language she spoke couldn't penetrate the commercial concerns that governed her professional relationships. The magazine needed usable photographs, the photographer needed to maintain his reputation, the industry needed Marilyn Monroe to continue being Marilyn Monroe, regardless of what that performance cost the woman creating it. Understanding what happened at Harper's Bazaar requires understanding what the fashion industry demanded of women in 1962. The modeling profession, especially at the highest editorial levels, operated according to brutal efficiency. Models arrived physically prepared, emotionally regulated, professionally compliant. They subordinated personal comfort to creative vision. They accepted that their bodies belonged temporarily to photographers and creative directors who would position and display them according to commercial needs. The best models learned to disconnect their sense of self from the images being produced. Marilyn Monroe had spent over a decade mastering this disconnection. She'd learned to separate Norma Jeane, the wounded girl from the foster care system, from Marilyn Monroe, the manufactured fantasy that generated millions in revenue. The separation had required psychological compartmentalization that would have challenged anyone's mental health. It had demanded she accept being valued primarily for physical appearance while simultaneously seeking recognition for intelligence and talent. It had forced her to perform sexuality for male consumption while maintaining some private sense of dignity and self-worth. The contradictions had been building pressure for years. The Harper's Bazaar session represented a moment when the compartments failed, when Norma Jeane and Marilyn Monroe collided in a studio filled with people who only wanted the fantasy. Marilyn Monroe's struggle against these forces anticipated conversations that wouldn't fully emerge until decades later. Her resistance in that Manhattan studio, her refusal to simply comply with photographic demands she found dehumanizing, represented early pushback against systems that treated women as decorative objects rather than autonomous human beings with artistic agency. Harper's Bazaar ultimately published 3 photographs from the February session in their April 1962 issue. The images showed Marilyn in elegant poses, wearing designer fashions that emphasized her famous figure while maintaining the sophisticated aesthetic the magazine preferred. Her expression in these photographs appeared serene, almost dreamlike. Nothing suggested the tension that had characterized the shoot. The magazine's copy described Marilyn as timeless, elegant, the embodiment of American beauty. Readers absorbed these images and narratives without knowing about the abbreviated session, the creative conflicts, the psychological crisis manifesting behind the camera's lens. These published photographs now exist as historical artifacts that reveal as much through what they conceal as through what they display. They show a woman who appears in control, beautiful, professionally polished. They hide a woman who is struggling to maintain basic functioning, who is consuming dangerous quantities of prescription medication, who is experiencing the kind of psychological distress that would, within months, contribute to her death. The disconnect between image and reality had always characterized Marilyn Monroe's public existence, but by February 1962, that disconnect had widened into a chasm too vast for even her considerable performance skills to bridge consistently. Photographic archives contain additional images from the session that Harper's Bazaar chose not to publish. These outtakes reveal more complicated truths. Some show Marilyn mid-adjustment, her face displaying fatigue or frustration rather than the serene beauty the published images conveyed. Others capture moments between poses when her body language communicated discomfort or withdrawal. These unpublished images didn't fit the narrative Harper's Bazaar wanted to tell, so they remained in archives, occasionally surfacing in retrospective exhibitions or biographies that attempted to document Marilyn's final months with less romanticism than the original publications employed. In the immediate aftermath of the session, neither Harper's Bazaar nor Marilyn Monroe publicly acknowledged any difficulties. The magazine treated the shoot as successful, publishing their selected images without editorial commentary about production complications. Marilyn made no statements about the experience, maintaining the professional silence expected of models and actresses regarding behind-the-scenes conflicts. Everyone involved had incentive to pretend the session had proceeded normally. This silence became more complicated after Marilyn's death in August 1962. Suddenly, every interaction from her final months carried retrospective significance. The Harper's Bazaar session transformed from a difficult but ultimately successful photo shoot into a warning sign that had gone unheeded. Crew members who'd been present began sharing their memories, describing Marilyn's behavior with the kind of detail that seemed meaningful only in hindsight. The photographer discussed how he'd recognized something was wrong but felt powerless to address mental health concerns that exceeded his professional responsibilities. These retrospective accounts must be evaluated carefully. Human memory becomes unreliable when filtering past events through tragic outcomes. Crew members who might barely have noticed Marilyn's distress during the actual session could, years later, remember obvious signs of impending crisis. The Harper's Bazaar session might have been exactly what it appeared, a difficult photo shoot with a struggling model. Or it might have been something more significant, a moment when Marilyn clearly communicated her deteriorating mental state to people who lacked the tools or willingness to respond appropriately. The photographs Harper's Bazaar published from that February session became some of the last professional images created before Marilyn's death 6 months later. They've since appeared in countless retrospectives, biographies, and exhibitions about her life and career. Art critics have analyzed them for signs of her psychological state. Fans have studied them looking for hidden meanings or revelations about her final months. The images have been reproduced so frequently that they've become part of Marilyn Monroe's iconography. What these images cannot convey is the human cost of their creation. They show a beautiful woman wearing elegant clothes, but they cannot communicate the psychological struggle required to produce that beauty. They display professional polish, but they hide the dysfunction that characterized the session. They present fantasy while concealing reality. In this way, they perfectly encapsulate Marilyn Monroe's entire relationship with photography and fame. The camera captured what it was designed to capture, marketable images that would sell magazines and reinforce established narratives about who Marilyn Monroe was supposed to be. Everything else, everything real and complicated and human, remained safely invisible. The Harper's Bazaar session from February 1962 wasn't the dramatic crisis some later accounts suggested. It wasn't a complete professional disaster. It was something more mundane and perhaps more tragic, a woman struggling to maintain functioning while industry machinery demanded performance she could no longer consistently deliver. The photographs that resulted were beautiful, but incomplete. They captured one version of Marilyn Monroe while missing everything that made her truly human. In the decades since her death, these images have taken on meaning Marilyn herself never experienced. They've become artifacts studied for clues about her psychological state, her relationships, her final months. But perhaps their real significance lies not in what they reveal about Marilyn Monroe specifically, but in what they demonstrate about how the entertainment and fashion industries treated women who generated profits. The session was difficult because Marilyn was suffering. The images were published anyway because magazines had deadlines and advertisers had expectations and commercial imperatives overrode human concerns. Marilyn Monroe died 6 months after posing for Harper's Bazaar, her body found in her Brentwood home surrounded by the pill bottles that had become her constant companions. The official verdict ruled probable suicide, though questions about the circumstances persist. What's undeniable is that a woman who had brought joy to millions, whose image had become synonymous with American beauty, died alone and struggling with demons the glossy magazine photographs could never capture. The Harper's Bazaar session didn't cause her death, but it revealed the fundamental disconnect between Marilyn Monroe, the commercial property, and Norma Jeane, the suffering human being. That disconnect, more than any single event or relationship, defined her final year and contributed to the tragedy that continues resonating decades later. The images from that February session remain in Harper's Bazaar's archives, beautiful and haunting reminders of everything we saw and everything we missed about Marilyn Monroe. They show us exactly what we wanted to see: glamour, beauty, perfection. They hide what we needed to see: pain, struggle, a woman drowning while everyone watched her smile.